Great.
Yes, we can hear you.
Good. All right. Well, thank you very much for joining this afternoon. So as I've said, my name is Carol Bertram. I'm currently the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Education. The journal is the Journal of the South African Education Research Association, or SAERA. Some of you may be familiar with that organization. If not, please do join and become a member. We're having a virtual conference in November, which will be a good place to engage and share research. So what I'm planning to do today is to look at the scope of the Journal of Education, which is really important in terms of knowing, is this the right journal or the appropriate journal to publish in? I'll be looking at some things around the indexing and metrics, the submission and the review process, the criteria that we use for review, and then how to engage with reviewers' comments. So this is just a screenshot of the journal website. We are fully online. It's an open access journal, so you don't have to register to access any of the articles. And you will see that on the website, you can see the list of the editorial team, the focus and scope, the current issue, any announcements, as well as sort of submission. So that's the website to go to. So just a very short history in where we're coming from. The Journal of Education is actually pretty old, 50-something years. And it started at the University of Natal in Pietermaritzburg as an in-house journal, fairly erratic. And it was in 1997 that it was accredited by SAPSI and really started to publish more from other authors from other universities. From 2002 to 16, we were publishing hard copies, actually printing a journal and sending them off to people in real post boxes, remember that? But for the last 4 years, since 2017, we've only published online. We use an open source software called the Open Journal System, which doesn't cost anything. And as I've said, it's open access. We were the journal of the Kenton Education Association. For those of you who remember the history, there have been a number of education associations in South Africa. Over the decades, SAERA was an attempt to join all of those associations together with the understanding that the previous associations would dissolve. That didn't really happen, but SAERA was established anyway, and the Kenton Education Association did dissolve, and SAERA was established in 2014, and the journal has now become the periodical of this association. However, you don't have to be a member of the association to publish in it, but we would encourage you to be a member. We publish 2 general issues per year in June and December. And then we always have a SAERA conference special issue published in the October following the previous year's conference. This year is a little bit different because we didn't have a conference last year. And then in March, there may also be an additional special issue, which is often edited by a SIG, which is a special interest group. And SAERA has a number of those SIGs. We can talk a little bit about that as well. Just to clarify the scope, so the journal is an interdisciplinary journal, so it is a generalist audience. It is peer-reviewed, blind peer-reviewed. It's an open access publication, and it is focusing on all levels of the education system and all processes of education. So formal, informal, non-formal, and then from early childhood all the way through schooling, adult education, vocational education, and higher education. A key issue around what the journal aims to publish are articles which show high levels of theoretical insight or analytic empirical work. It gives preference to articles that demonstrate engagement on the key issues that face South African education. So what we mean by that is issues that would be engaged would be interesting to a generalist audience, not incredibly specific topics, those are better sent to a specialized journal. And what we mean by issues internal to education, it's an interest in issues around assessment, pedagogy, curriculum, knowledge, rather than too much around the kind of external forces that impact on education. And what the journal is academic, of course it is, but the key thing is the readers are considered to be educational generalists. So when you are submitting your article, just to say, articles that do not fit the scope of the journal are those that are very descriptive. So if you have data that you have only described and have not actually engaged with in an analytic or theoretical kind of manner, that is not fitting for the Journal of Education, or studies that are so context bound or so specific, and you haven't made it clear how that context specificness or specificity can speak to bigger, more national or more global issues. And then topics that are very, very specific are generally more appropriate for specialist journals. So these are some titles that we've had recently. The adequacy of resource supply to care centers for the effective implementation of the learning program for learners with severe to profound intellectual disabilities in the Northwest Province. A very specific focus, which we would say would not really be appropriate to a generalist audience and would probably be more usefully sent to a journal on inclusive education or educational psychology. And this one, 20 years of higher education strategic planning in Mozambique, trends of gender equity in admissions and graduations. So again, very, very specific. So it's about higher education strategic planning, but particularly around gender equity. Obviously, it depends how the author engages with these topics, and one can obviously extend these topics to show how they are relevant and appropriate and can speak to the bigger issue. But if they do not, then that again would be probably more appropriate to a journal, either on gender or perhaps one on higher education. All right, so just a quick discussion around metrics and analytics, which seems to be the big issue or growing issue as we start to measure everything in our neoliberal world. Journals are now measured as to whether they're quartile 1 or 2 or 3, or what their impact factor is, what their H index is, and all of these things. The Journal of Education is indexed by SciELO, which is the Scientific Electronic Library online. This is an open source database. So this particular journal or particular database or library is focused on only open access journals. It's actually based in South America. So it has a strong focus on the global South, which is really great. It is recognized, the journal is recognized by DHET, so if it does get recognized for subsidy purposes. We're also indexed by DOAJ, which is the Directory of Open Access Journals, again, the focus on open access. And then just this year, we have been indexed by Scopus, which is not open access, of course, and is run by Elsevier. But Scopus is an indexing system that will then start to trawl and look at the DOIs of the various articles that we publish, and should just make our journals or our articles more accessible. So just to say, what does it mean that we're part of SciELO or DOAJ and Scopus? It is some, maybe what's the word, a label of saying it does meet particular quality criteria, such as blind peer review. There's got to be regular publications. You've got to have clear information about fees, about copyright. You've got to be transparent about who the editorial board is. They must be experts in the field. The management and ownership of the journal must be clearly indicated. There's a whole range of kind of quality criteria. Obviously not, these are proxies for quality, but they are one way of ensuring that a journal is not a predatory journal and is not publishing not good stuff. ASAF in South Africa also has a national code of best practice for publications, for editorial discretion and peer review, and we adhere to that code as well. So these are some of the things to look out for in terms of a journal and whether it is a quality journal. If you're interested in looking further at other journals in South Africa, there are a range of them in education. There are actually more than 17, but ASAF in fact, did a review, a peer review of 17 South African scholarly journals. Last year, this report was published, and it's a very useful report to just get a sense of which journals are out there and what is the quality of what is being published. So just to get a sense of journals, so because we are indexed with Cielo, we do get the kind of analytics, which gives you a sense of how many people access the journal website. And you can see that it, we only went online in 2017. You can see that these are the PDFs, are the red PDFs that are downloaded or accessed. And it ranges around about 2,500. It goes up here to maybe 4,000, goes down again. There's a spike. Generally, there's a spike when we publish a new issue, but it does give you a sense of just how many people are accessing the journal. It is becoming more accessible, which is good. And this also gives us a sense of, in the number of years, of how many issues are published and how many articles are published each year. It's not a huge journal. We publish maybe 8 to 9 articles per issue, and we have 3 to 4 issues a year. But you can see that the number of citations that our articles are receiving is growing, which is really great. So what it means is that obviously, as you have more stuff on the web as well, the number of citations will be increasing. But that's really good news, because what we want obviously is people to read the stuff that we're publishing and to engage with it and to cite it. Back issues are now being uploaded onto the OJS site. As I say, we only went onto that site in 2017, but we do have back issues which are slowly getting uploaded, and therefore those will also become more accessible. In terms of before 2012, we would actually need to start scanning because we don't have those as PDFs, but that is something we might start to do. I think it is just quite a useful thing to think about how, when you're thinking about a journal and where you want to publish, is to think about how do readers access your article. And there are 2 options. The one option is that the user pays. So that is the person who reads your article. You as the author do not publish for a fee, you publish for free. And these are usually the big journals that are published by Taylor and Francis, Routledge, Elsevier. They're big for-profit publishers. They charge the reader, not you as the author. So what that means is they will publish it for free, but they take copyright. And as you know, then you are not free to publish that article on ResearchGate or to make your article publicly available, because it's no longer yours. You've basically sold it to the publisher. And the way that the publishers make money is they then sell your article to the reader. And if journal or if libraries subscribe to particular databases, like at UKZN and other libraries as well, they will buy these databases. They're very expensive, but it means that then you can access the journal articles. If you don't have a subscription, or your university doesn't have a subscription, then the reader buys the article, which is quite expensive. The other option is an open access option where there's no paywall for the reader, but usually it does mean that the author may have to pay a small fee. So in this option, the author pays and the reader reads for free, which is the option that we've gone for with the Journal of Education. So open access journals charge the author an APC, which is called an article publication charge. In South Africa, generally these are fairly reasonable. In some the journals I've looked at charge between 4,500 to maybe 7,000. Some are a lot higher, 16,000. So be careful that you have checked the fee before you get the bill for publishing your article. Yeah, you must be aware. So with this issue here, in terms of if you want to publish with the big for-profit publishers, in order to make your article open access, it's very expensive for South Africans. It's about $2,500, about 45,000 Rand to make your article open access, which is obviously what everybody would like to do. But for many South African academics, that is a huge fee to pay unless you've got a very large research cost center. Overseas, many universities will just pay that to make it open access. But in South Africa, I don't think there are many universities that do that. So just in terms of copyright, the Journal of Education, so copyright is lodged with you. You keep copyright of your article. In terms of Creative Commons, this is the copyright license that we have, which basically means that your article can be distributed, but the author must be attributed. The article can't be used for commercial purposes. Nobody should sell your article, and the work cannot be modified or adapted in any way. So it's it can be distributed as it is, as a PDF, but it can't be modified or in any way. But it means that you can post it on ResearchGate, you can post it wherever you like if you want to, as long as it's clear that it was first published in the Journal of Education and it credits the journal as the first site of publication. All right, so if we look at the guidelines, which you will find on the website, not very different from, I think, any journal that you're looking at. Unfortunately, you can't send your article off to 5 journals and hope that one of them will say yes. One of the ethical options is that it can only have been submitted to this journal. So you can't submit it to a number at the same time. The research must have been approved by an approved ethics committee. There's no submission charge, so you don't have to pay to submit. But if your article is published, there will be an article processing fee. And these are the criteria that the reviewers will use to review your article if it goes forward for review. And I'm not going to go into this in too much detail here because I'm going to look at it later in this presentation. So you submit via the OJS system, which is there. It's quite clear. You have to register. You need an ORC ID, which is very useful for all researchers. It's free. You simply register at this website and it creates a unique number for you, which then will be allocated to all of your articles. And it means that people can search you more easily if you're willing to be surveilled on the web. And the NRF, in fact, I think now is also requiring that all researchers have an ORC ID. So please be aware of the maximum length. We are flexible, maybe up to 8,000 words, but not too much beyond that. And our citation and referencing system is APA 7th. A blind review means that your name should not appear on the article at all. And in terms of the submission to OJS, your name will appear in your metadata because you are submitting your name and your institution, etc., not on the document. All right, so the document you submit must be ready for blind review. So what that means is your name does not appear at all, or you and your authors, co-authors, and anything that you have cited must also be replaced by the term author. So that is really important. That is the journal, that is the version of the article that you submit, a blind review version. So your name and affiliation, etc., will be on the electronic submission system, on the metadata system, and those two things talk to each other. This is just an overview of where you would make your submission, and you click here, make a new submission, and it gives you a checklist of things to look at, that it hasn't been published before, the file submission, that you've used 1.5 spacing, etc., that you've used the APA 7, that you've ensured a blind review, and that you've submitted it to a plagiarism screening software, and you've had it copy edited. So that's the checklist. And then ideally, let's hope that if it gets through the first review with the editors and the editorial committee, that it goes through peer review, which means a process of subjecting your scholarly work to the scrutiny of others, to your peers who are experts in the field that you are writing in. First of all, the editorial committee will screen the initial submissions and decide if the paper should go for review. One of the key things about reviewing is that it's voluntary. So it is a labor that is done by academics for free. They don't get paid for it. It really relies on the goodwill and the professional judgments of the academics who are selected for their expertise. What this often means, as academics get busier and busier, that it can be quite difficult sometimes to find reviewers who are willing to do the work. A double blind review means that the author doesn't know who the reviewers are, and the reviewer doesn't know who the authors are either. We hope that that reviewing process is formative and that the reviewers give authors feedback that can help to improve a paper. So this is the system that we go through. You would submit here on the system. Your first review process is through the editorial committee, and if it doesn't meet the scope or the criteria, we might say here, you know, it's too specific, I think is often one of the reasons for rejection at this level, and that it would be more appropriate to a more specialized journal, for example. Often people ask, how long does it take? This is a lengthy process, and usually up to 9 months, I would say. But we certainly try and make this first decision within the first 2 to 4 weeks. If it then, you would then get a decision that says, sorry, we're not sending it out for review. And then what you need to do is send it out to the next journal. I always say it's quite useful to have a list of at least 3, so you know if a rejection comes back that you can send it on to the next one. Peer review can take between 6 to 16 weeks, even longer sometimes. You know, so the peer reviewers are asked, some of them might do it within a week, some you keep on chasing, and after 6 weeks they haven't done it, and then you might say, well, now we need to find another person who then might also take another 6 weeks. So this process is long, as any of you who may have been working within the academic field in terms of examination. It can be a long process. And it's very difficult, as we say, to chase people because everyone is doing it voluntarily. And sometimes some papers are just not easy to find reviewers for. So that is the process. Once all the reviews come in, and it would be a minimum of 2, we usually try and aim for 3 reviews, particularly, and this is another thing that might slow things down. If one reviewer says yes and another reviewer says no, we might then have to submit it to a third reviewer to get more feedback, or perhaps the editor might take on that role, or somebody on the editorial committee. So then there's a decision, and the editor will look at the reviewer's comments and say, okay, at this point we either accept it, or it can be still rejected at this point after the reviewer's comments, or there can be a revise and resubmit, which is generally the option. It's seldom that something is accepted completely straight off the bat like that. As the revision, you would be given, say, 2 to 6 weeks. It all depends on where we are in the sort of publication cycle. We usually need kind of at least 4 weeks for copy editing, layout, and proofing, because it goes back to you as the author. You need to check that the changes are correct. It goes back to the copy editor, and that can be a kind of backwards and forwardsing issue. So usually the time is 6 to 12 months between submission and publication, if everything goes well. These are the issues that we have in the journal. So again, it would depend, when you submit, as to which issues are coming up. Yeah, I wonder if I should stop there and just see if there are any comments from anybody. Does anyone want to stick up their hand or make a comment at this point? No comments. I can't see any hands, so I will assume that everything is fine. All right. Great. This is just an interesting thing. I was looking at some journals. So this is a big British journal, the Journal of Education Policy, and it's quite interesting in terms of how they give their speed of acceptance. They say that it's a 7-day average from submission to first decision. Interestingly enough, why I was looking at this is because I just submitted to them, but I think I submitted about 3 weeks ago, and I still haven't heard anything from them. So average is obviously an average. And then they're saying 78 days, which would be, about 3 months from first submission to post-review decision. But what's interesting here is 11% acceptance rate. So if you get published here, you're in the top in the top form there. And this is from Elsevier. This is the Teaching and Teacher Education, which is another interesting, very high level journal. And you can see that they give you, again, weeks. And again, it's quite interesting. So they say 5.8 weeks to first decision, which is a lot longer than the 7 days that the Journal of Education Policy says. But then they say here the submission to final decision is only 9 weeks, which is quite quick, really. So it's interesting. You can look at these kind of metrics, and that can also influence the journal that you that you submit to. And with everything being online, it's quite easy to see that that kind of information these days. So what I want to move on to now is just look at some common comments from reviewers at the journal that maybe give you some sense of what we're expecting and what we're looking for. These are some of the comments that come through. There is no clear, coherent argument. The study is presented as a summarized version of a thesis rather than making a clear knowledge claim. The literature review is outdated and does not show a good understanding of the field. The paper reports what we already know about the field. It doesn't add anything new. And the data is simply described. It's not analyzed or interpreted. So if you look at those kind of comments, you start to see these are the kinds of things that, I don't think it's only the Journal of Education, I'm sure all journals would be looking for arguments, clear knowledge claims, good understandings of the field, this idea of adding something new, and definitely needing to see analysis of data and not simply description. So let's have a look at this in a little bit more detail. So these are the kind of criteria that we say to our reviewers please comment on whether the paper, for example, represents a rigorous inquiry, which may be conducted either through argumentation, so it might be a literature review or a conceptual paper, or it might be an empirical paper. So what we mean by this is that articles need to show a systematic and conceptual engagement with the field. It's not simply, we're not a practice journal that focuses on how to make practice better. It's not about how to teach better or how to assess or implement the curriculum better. We're looking for articles that present or represent a rigorous inquiry into educational issues. We're not about saying, you know, here's the policy, how can we ensure that teachers implement it better? So what we mean by this is that the thinking needs to go beyond the kind of normative or ideological ideas of what should be happening. So we're looking for in-depth engagement and critiques around the kind of ideas that are often taken for granted. So, for example, sometimes writers may assume that learner-centered education or inquiry-based education is always the best thing. But that's not what the literature says. And it's more nuanced, it's more in-depth, it's more complex. So we're looking for you to engage with the literature and the critiques and the debates and show an in-depth and rigorous inquiry. So here we had an example of an author who said this indisputably, and be careful of using these kinds of words because this is meaning it cannot be disputed, but generally most things in academia can be disputed. But this author is saying indisputably, effective teachers personalize learning for their learners as they recognize that they develop at different rates and have different abilities. And what the reviewer said is that essentially this is not indisputable. This is a belief, it's a normative belief in learner-centered education. And there's a lot of research that shows that that is simply not possible in very large classrooms. There's a large body of research that questions the appropriateness of learner-centered education in Africa. See these articles. So you might have a reviewer that says, actually, you need to expand your thinking or your reading a little bit further. And I guess in a sense to show that nothing really is indisputable. And this moves on to the next criterion, which is to say we need an adequate, fair and accurate presentation of the relevant literature in the area of focus. So the literature must not be outdated. Please be careful of, we had a paper recently that was kind of looking at learner achievement and in South Africa, and all the studies it was quoting was from like 2002, 2003. That's quite a long time ago for empirical work. You need to be showing updated recent literature. It must be fairly represented. It shouldn't be a biased representation. So again, this sense of nothing is indisputable, engage with critique and show the significant fields. Obviously, you would be saying this is my particular focus, but you still need to show that you understand that there are more than one perspective on a particular topic. So for example, one reviewer said this, that the author was making a presumptuous claim that active citizenship is not such a new concept in South Africa. Clearly, the author did not do adequate research in and about this matter to come to such a conclusion. So the reviewer is arguing that the author has not engaged with this topic of active citizenship in sufficient depth. And here's another reviewer. The literature that is presented in the introduction is quite outdated and must be revised. The use of the ANA results is problematic. In schooling, this stands for the Annual National Assessment results. And there were problems with those. They are not valid for comparison across years, and they also took place now about 10 years ago. So it's again, what is the kind of evidence that you're drawing on? And is it robust, sufficiently robust? Then the validity and the power of the evidence, this links to that, marshal to support the author's argument. So we're saying, don't simply describe the data to say this is what the teacher said, or this is what they did, this is what the lecturers told us. You've got to show that there's a deeper level of analysis and engagement. Sometimes we get papers where a theory is presented and never used again. So it must be used to analyze the data if you're bringing in some kind of conceptual framework or theory. The data must be trustworthy. So again, it's about the validity of the claims that you can make. These are basic tenets for quality research, not particular to our journal at all. But I remember one paper where the author was making claims about the teacher's practice, but in fact, the data came from self-reported questionnaire data. So all you can say with that is the teachers say that they do X, Y, and Z. You can't actually claim what they actually do because you haven't observed it. You've only got self-reported data. So, you know, the robustness of the kind of claims that you can make is really important. So this is just the takeaway: ensure that your claims are well supported by evidence, which may either be your own data or the literature. So this is an example of a reviewer's comment. The research as it stands is very descriptive. It does not use the conceptual tools provided by this framework that was actually presented. I recommend that the data presented in the paper be more rigorously analyzed so that the knowledge contribution is elevated above a level of description. The biggest concern that I have is that the data is presented in its very raw form. So you can't simply just present chunks of data from your interview schedules and say, this is what teachers said. You have got to interpret and make meaning and theorize and engage with that data and take it to a higher level of analysis. So I think this we've said before, the extent to which interpretations and conclusions are credible and warranted by the nature and the scope of the field work. We've made that point already. This was just a comment or something written by an author. The study revealed that this intervention can be the panacea. Now, this is again a very, very strong word. Panacea means it is the ultimate solution to literacy development challenges faced by underprivileged learners in South Africa and other similar environments. There are very few panaceas in South Africa. There are very few interventions that you can call a panacea. We've been trying for many, many decades to find them. I don't think they exist. And so to make that kind of claim is a very strong claim. And the reviewer then said the paper makes a very broad claim, which is not supported by evidence, because in fact the data collected was based only on one classroom. So you can't say I collected this data in classroom A, and therefore I'm arguing that this pedagogy is a panacea to improve the entire education system. There's a mismatch between the claim that you're making and the nature and the scope of the field work and the data that you've presented. Then the issue of contribution to the field is quite a tricky one because we need some way of seeing how your study links to the bigger picture. Every field has its scholarship, be it curriculum or assessment or social justice, issues of gender, diversity, critical race theory. They all have their particular field of scholarship. And you have both got to show that you've understood that field, but also that in some way you're making a tiny contribution to showing that maybe your data verifies what other studies in the field have shown, or perhaps your data shows something slightly different to what other studies in the field have shown. Or you might be saying, this theory, I'm adding a little bit to this theory or to this conceptual framework. So it's just about showing how your little paper contribution is connected to other studies and how it links to the overarching questions. It's the significance, it's that so what question. You know, to have a paper that simply tells us what we already know. We don't need more papers that tell us about how poor literacy or numeracy is in South African classrooms. You've got to show then what is your paper adding to the knowledge that we already have in the field. So you might, for example, have a reviewer that says this sets up a very useful framework to think about conflict and models it in a way that PhD or master's students can use. So you could see that here the contribution was a new framework to think about the field. But then you also get comments like this. This is a very small case study that doesn't say anything about foundation phase that we don't already know. And it's not the fact that, you know, a case study often is small, but you've got to then show what your particular contribution is. And then coherence, the clarity, the way that it all hangs together, the purpose that you identify in the introduction must be the purpose that runs through the whole paper, that it's consistent. It's this idea of having one clear, coherent argument that runs through. If you've got research questions that you've put forward, make sure that you answer them. So don't answer questions that you didn't ask, and don't ask questions that you don't have data to answer. There was a paper that said, you know, it's got two research questions: how is natural science taught, and how do learners learn natural science? But in fact, they had no data for the second question. So the paper was in fact just about this. It was about how natural science is taught, but it didn't focus on how learners learn. And so the suggestion from the reviewer here was to say, take that away. Maybe it was part of a thesis or something, but in terms of this paper, just focus on how natural science is taught. If your paper does go for review and it's been a couple of months and you're waiting and waiting and thinking, am I ever going to get comments back? And sometimes the email that we get is the email we didn't want. This is one that I got last year. I am sorry to inform you that we cannot accept your paper for publication. You will see the review comments. I hope you'll find the comments constructive. If you choose to submit your work to a different journal, I hope you will achieve success. So that's the kind of emails we don't like to get, a rejection at that point. But as somebody said, if you're not getting rejected, it means you're not writing enough or you're not submitting enough papers. It's part of the journey. It's part of the process. Yes, one gets angry, one gets upset. And I guess you grieve in a way because you've kind of like put your heart and soul into this paper. And then it's never fun to have other people's comments saying, actually, we didn't think it's as good as you thought it was. But you've got to let it go. You've got to move on. And often what that simply means is sending it to another journal, submit it to another journal. This idea of having more than one. So don't just think, okay, I'm going to submit it to the Journal of Education. Be clear that if that is rejected, then you're going to try the Journal of Education as Change, or you're going to try Perspectives in Education, or whatever. If you do get the revise and resubmit, again, you've really got to engage with what they are saying. I think it's about thinking the reviewer is not saying these things because they're nasty or because they've got it in for you. They don't know who you are. They are just responding to your work. And so it's about saying, okay, let me be open to see what can I learn from these comments? How can I strengthen this article? So don't be defensive about it if you can. And again, it takes some time, sometimes a week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks have to pass before you engage. So it's about learning from the feedback, using it to strengthen your work, and taking it in a formative sense of saying, well, yeah, this is a good, I can see that I didn't do this, or I can see this was missing, or I can see that that argument was quite poor. Let me fix it. Let me strengthen it. And I really like this thing from Dylan William on assessment. He talks about good feedback makes you think. So that's what you want your reviewers' comments to do. Don't focus just on the technical points. Those are often the easiest points to deal with, just like they are with your supervisor on your you know, that idea of it's a missing reference, or it's an incorrect citation, or I can fix this quite easily. But then the conceptual issues shouldn't be dealt with superficially. Don't just insert a sentence here or there if you've been asked to really engage with an argument. You know, if a reader, you know, an awesome, sorry, a reviewer might say, this paper would be actually very useful for you, then look at it, read it, engage with it, and see how it might help you strengthen your paper. And then you really need to show the editors how you've engaged with the comments. Sometimes you might get contradictory comments, and then you need to say, you know, reviewer A said this, but reviewer B said the opposite. I've chosen to go with reviewer A because of X, Y, and Z. Generally, authors are required to make changes in track changes or red font. That's what we require in the journal. So you will submit a new copy that has got the track changes to show the new texts or the amended texts, as well as a kind of a table like this, where on the one side you write what the reviewer has said, and on this side you write how you have addressed that particular, you know. So you know, here the reviewer is saying it's not clear what you mean by opportunity to learn. Please clarify. And so here you might say, I've now included a sentence that attempts to clarify what opportunity to learn means in the context of this study. Need a reference for the statement, and then you simply say it's been included. Here's something around acronyms, lots and lots of acronyms. They said, okay, we've now written them out in full, etc. So these are quite technical, but not all of them might be, and you really need to engage with how that is done. Yeah. And yeah, as we finish up, I think the key, I've really focused here just on publishing in our journal, but I think the criteria are similar for all journals. And in 2 weeks' time, I will look at how you can actually map a kind of publication plan from your thesis, and then look at particular journals and do some abstract writing, etc. But obviously, working at reading and writing, if this is your job as an academic, you need to keep reading new methodologies, new articles, new theories. Keep a reading journal that you keep up to date, where you're making notes about the things that you're reading, you're thinking about the new ideas that are coming through, so that it becomes clear that you understand the field of scholarship. It can be very helpful to write a joint paper with a colleague. Often what PhD students do is they write their first paper with their supervisor to learn through participation in terms of how do you actually engage with this practice of drafting a journal article. We just have to write. It's something it's very hard to find time to do because we're so busy doing many other things, our teaching and marking, admin, emails, etc., etc. But I think the thing is, it's very difficult to wait for the perfect time. There isn't a perfect time, so we just have to carve out some time in the day. Sometimes it's really nice if you can take a whole day or 2 days or 3 days for a retreat where you switch off your email and your phone and you can really just focus. Is fantastic if you can do that. But often in our normal days, we just have to try and find maybe 25 minutes a day where we just focus. Focus on generating your ideas, what you actually want to communicate. Don't get stuck in editing and trying to write the perfect sentence. Those things can come later. Rather just generate your key ideas first. It's very helpful if you can find another colleague, 1 or 2 or 3 people that are willing to engage with your work and you engage with their work, give them critical feedback, receive critical feedback. This idea of having critical friends for support and mentoring is really vital. Great. So that's all I've got to say. Just to say, for the rest of the year, we have got a special issue coming up within the next few weeks, which is the special interest group on knowledge building in educational practices. We've then got another special edition, which is around interlocking inequalities, crises, and education in the Global South, which will be published in October. Our general issue will be published in December. So that's where we are for the year. For next year, we've got a special issue that is actually still open. So if anybody is interested in assessment and testing, that is the special interest group who is editing that journal for March. And you will see that the submission of full papers is due at the end of August. So you have still got time. If that is your field, then I strongly suggest that you engage with that. It can be quite helpful to focus on a special issue. Sometimes it's a little bit easier to get published in a special issue because you know what the focus is. And that's our schedule for next year. All right, these are just some resources. If you're interested, becoming a reviewer on the journal is very helpful. If you want to understand how that process works, you can register on the website. Please include a list of your research interests. If you're interested in engaging more with how to write, this I find a very useful book by Pat Thompson and Barbara Kamler called Writing for Peer-Reviewed Journals. Rhodes University has a very useful postgraduate site called Enhancing Postgraduate Environments. It will also have a lot of support. There's a range of blogs. Pat Thompson, the same person here, writes a blog on publishing. Dr. Sharon Clarence also has written a blog about writing, academic writing. So those are very useful. There's a huge amount out there. One can get completely overwhelmed. So often we can just keep, instead of just thinking about it, but let's get writing. All right. I hope that was helpful. I'm going to stop sharing. I'm going to switch on my video. And what is the time? It's 5 to 5. So if anyone has got, hello, Janet. If anyone's got any comments, let me see if there's anything in the chat. Thank you. Just some thank yous. Great. Are there any comments that anyone has? Anyone want to stick up a hand? Yes, the recording will be available on the SAERA, either linked to the SAERA website or on the SAERA has a YouTube videos for a YouTube site, as far as I know.
Yep, it will be on the YouTube site.
Oh, great. Hi, Lebby. How's it?
Fine.
Good. No comments, no questions.
Hi, hi, Carol.
Hello, hi.
Hi, that was a really informative introduction, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. So thank you very much for that. I have a question. You know, very early on in the description, you stated quite categorically that the purpose of the Journal of Education is not for classroom practice. It's not about implementing practice. So I'm really interested in that. What then is the epistemological bent or the thrust of the Journal of Education? I mean, for what purpose is it there? You know, I'm both in the classroom, I'm a teacher, I'm also a teacher, I'm also an education researcher. And I like to see the two coming together. My educational research is for the purpose of how things are implemented in the classroom for the betterment of educating the students. So what then would you say we do with the theory that is produced in the Journal of Education? Where does that go to? What is the purpose of it?
Thanks, Shifa. That's a really useful point. Sorry, maybe I wasn't making myself very clear. I wasn't meaning that we're not interested in what's happening in classrooms. We definitely are. And if you look at what is published, there is a lot of stuff around pedagogy. What I'm saying is that we're not interested in, it needs to be theorized, as you're saying. So it needs to be engaged with in critical and empirically based ways. That's what I'm saying. We're not, I guess what I meant was, we're not a journal that is looking for practical solutions to saying, you know, here's, it's kind of that normative thing of saying, here's the best solution ever, and here it is. You know, that kind of evangelical sense of pedagogy, like we've found the best way to do something and everybody must be doing it like this. I think a lot of practitioners are, so it's not that we're not interested in pedagogy, we really, really are, but I think we're interested in a theorized and or analytically engaged pedagogy, rather than a sense of, this is what CAPS tells us to do, look here, the teachers are all doing what they're told to do, which is some of the kind of articles that we get. I don't know if that makes sense, that kind of very normative approach.
I hear what you're saying, and I also want to then ask you, you know, in a lot of research, there's the so what. So what if you've got this theory? Where does it go to? What can I do with this theory? So that in that vein, I'm asking then, because if it's not to implement in classrooms, what's the alternative? What are you suggesting with the Journal of Education? Where does the theory go to? Who are you hoping will read this? And is it meant for implementation? Is it meant to just be theory out there for those who are interested? Which is it, for example, is it art for art's sake?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I think there is a sense of wanting to say, so what does theory help us to do? And I think that is really important, that it is theory that then enables us to look at our practice and look at what we're doing in different kinds of ways. What sorry, I'm not making this very clear. I guess it's about those articles where people are just saying, this is the only way to do something. And if we all did it like this, everything would be fine. It's that kind of sense of saying, no, there's not one answer. It's complex. Yeah, so I guess it's kind of that sense of saying we want some sort of rigor. We want some sort of theoretical and analytic engagement with what's happening. So not just pure description, because I think we have a lot of description about what's happening in South African classrooms. Hey? We know a lot, but what we don't necessarily have is why, and how do we explain what is happening in ways that, as you say, can then help us to do that in a different kind of way. So it's pushing that empirical work into a way of I guess, a kind of more rigorous explanatory framework or ways of doing things that we really are interested in, very much so. So I think if you read what we're publishing, there is a lot of stuff on pedagogy, on assessment, but what we're trying to do is say, how do we really engage with, yeah, I think you're right, with theory in a way that will enable us to do something different. But I think what happens in South Africa often, these things become normative and we simply start to accept them as given. Does that make sense?
Thank you. Thank you, Carol. I think there's another question coming up.
Okay, great. Thanks, Shifa. Michael, I see your hand up. Hi.
Hi, Carol. I just want to extend your argument there, Carol, in terms of what is the value of theory. And I think we're often novice young researchers and very strong practitioner-based researchers tend to believe that the agenda of writing is to provide direction for practice. Whereas I think a journal by definition, or being an educational research journal, draws on the tradition of what is research. Research is being able to look again at the nature of practice, to look and provide vocabulary, provide syntax from ways of re-examining equally the way of what we take for granted in our practices. So I think from the point of view of a journal is about developing scholarship, about developing insight, about developing a way of looking and re-looking at the world of practice. And by definition, it is theoretical. Now, lots of people have a negative understanding about this concept theory as if it is only ivory towered. But by, as you indicated, the very nature of theory is that it gives us tools to be able to critique the range of practices that might be in operation within the worldviews that we engage with. So I think Shipa is correct to be able to say, well, what do we do with the theorizing? And I think that the purpose of the Journal of Education is to be able to assist us to not just develop more and more theory, but to be able to develop new ways of looking at what we're doing and engaging with the re-looking at what we're doing. So I would like to underscore that scholarship involves that deeper connection than purely a description of best practices.
Thanks, Michael. That's useful.
Thanks.
And I think that sense of theory as also an explanatory, a way of explaining what we see in order to understand it better and hopefully to do it better perhaps as well. I see two comments. The one was just in the chat from Pateka. Would you clarify what, in terms of general articles? So what we have is two general issues, and then we have special issues. So the special issue would be something from usually the special interest groups. So for example, the one coming up next March is on assessment. So it means if your focus is assessment and testing, then you will submit to that special issue. The general issue is open to any submission. That's what a general issue is. It's not about a particular topic. Any submission is acceptable for the general issue. And then the other issue was around informal education. Absolutely. Very happy to, it's not just formal education. It's not just schooling. Again, I think it's quite important, when you're choosing your journal that you want to submit to, read the articles or scan through at least the abstracts and the titles. And it gives you a sense of what are the topics that are published in that journal. And what can be very helpful as well is to see what are the other key issues that are being raised, and then how do you talk back or engage with them. And I think that is sort of the sense of what one wants a scholarly journal to do, to create fields of interest and key questions, critical questions, and then how do you, maybe your work builds on that, or maybe it critiques it, or maybe it extends it. And then you can kind of create this conversation within the field. So definitely, yes, informal stuff. Any other questions or comments? No. All right. I don't see any hands. So I think that's, we will call it an evening then. Thank you all very much for your engagement, for being here. We appreciate that. And we hope that you will consider the journal. And just to say, in 2 weeks' time, so on the 1st of July, the focus will be for particularly postgraduate students on how you can map out your a publication map from your thesis. How do you work out what you're going to publish, and how and where you're going to submit? So it'll be a bit more practical around looking at a range of different journals, at appropriate journals. We'll have some time to actually focus on writing up an abstract, a tiny text, as Kamla and Thompson call it. Yeah, so I might see you then in 2 weeks' time. Excellent. Thank you so much. Cheers.